Throughout the late 19th and into the 20th centuries, nations developed new naval technologies that led to the creation of ever larger ships. One of those types of ships was, of course, the battleship. Every naval power, ranging from the United Kingdom to Japan, was developing battleships. Even South American and Balkan nations were caught up in creating these colossal fighting machines. However, not every battleship or large ship created idea developed was the best. In that same vein, already existing battleships in need of modernization might have problems. In today's video, we're going to look at 3 unique and some terrible warships, Charles Martel ideas. First up, we have a French battleship from the late 19th century, the Charles Martel. She was part of a larger class dubbed the Fleet of Samples, as they were all slightly different from each other. In the late 1880s, construction of battleships had been suspended and then resumed with the powers that be favoring the Jean-Col fleet composition that focused on smaller craft when to take from Stephen S. Roberts and French warships in the Age of Steam, 1859 to 1914. During the 1880s and 1890s, all navies had to adjust to the fundamental technological challenges, above all, the torpedo. In France, this adjustment involved heated polemics in the press and in Parliament by partisans of the Jean-Col. Literally, young school favoring torpedo boats as a replacement for the mastodon battleships. While much of the Navy and its civilian supporters defended battleships as the only lasting form of sea power, got Phoenix right this time. With that in mind, on January 7, 1886, Rear Admiral Abbey, the leader of the Jean-Col, became Minister of Marine. Now, he lasted until May of 1887, and for the sake of time, without delving too deep into it, battleship construction continued under a new minister. Along with that, in February 1887, with the renewal of the Triple Alliance between Germany, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, there were calls for a stronger navy and thus a rather ambitious building program that was to come to be in 1890, which included the building of battleships. Charles Martel, named for Charles the Hammer Martel, famous for the Battle of Tours in 732, was a part of a larger building program. As I mentioned, taken from Rogerio Staglini and Michel Constantino in the French fleet, Ships, Strategy, and Operations 1870 to 1918. The 5 ships were built in 5 different dockyards, arsenals, and shipyards where the relevant construction managers introduced their significant modifications. Charles Martel, Carnot, and Jagabari were laid down in 1891. Messina followed in September 1892, and Bouvet in early 1893. Since the design modifications introduced by the dockyard, arsenals, and shipyards related to the hull and superstructure, it is difficult to understand fully their logic. The only effective need being to avoid overloading and to overcome stability issues. Taking into account the final result, it is safe to assume that these objectives were not reached. The 5 ships had in common only a tumble-home shape and the layout of the main caliber guns arranged in 4 single turrets, of which 2 were placed along the center line and 2 other ships on sponsons. This disposition would allow both broadside and forward fire. Even though a trend of the time was going towards line-ahead formation of capital ships that emphasized broadside fire, the design of Charles Martel was effectively the same as Carnot, a ship we have discussed previously, although Carnot is more of a copy of the Charles Martel. Anyway, taking from Roberts again reported to Minister Barbet that the Works Council on June 12, 1890 had identified Yuan's 13,273-ton design, and the one by Sagalot is suitable for further work, but that, once the Council's suggestions were incorporated, the displacement would approach 14,000 tons. On the other hand, the Council, reflecting the view of many flag officers, formally rejected the armament of 4 274.4 mm guns as inadequate and wanted greater penetration power for 2 guns of the new battleship. After some debate between 340 mm guns and 305 mm guns, they chose the new 305 mm 45 caliber gun. As it goes with French designs, there were debates about smaller caliber guns, armor, and so on. Generally normal stuff. Thus, Charles Martel was laid down on August 1, 1891. We're taking from Roberts again. The belt armor was ordered in 4 lots. 1 hammered steel from Schneider, and 3 of compound metal from Merrill-Frass Stim and Chadion at Conant. About 2/3 of the belt was compound, and 1/3 steel. This was the first use of nickel steel and belt armor in France. Pretty innovative. But as with all ships of this class, Charles Martel ran into some issues whilst building. As early as August 1891, when she was laid down, there were serious concerns about the ship being overweight, which did take some reworking. And by 1893, they had worked out the design superstructure would be modified to reduce its weight and reduce the target it provided to enemy high-explosive shells. 2 small readouts placed under the longitudinal bridge, 1 forward and 1 aft, whose purpose was to accommodate a single 47mm gun each, were suppressed, the guns being relocated. The Admiral's smoking gallery was suppressed, to be replaced in this function by the deck after the Admiral's cabin on either side of the after 305mm turret. The flare locker was also suppressed, the flares being stowed elsewhere, with the superstructure under the longitudinal bridge, flying deck, thus being eliminated. The bridge was lowered to 4 meters above the deck, and the conning tower was also lowered. The foremast was reduced in height to match the aftermast. Brest plans for the ship where it was being built because, remember, each individual dockyard could alter the design of the battleship. They had to suppress the eye-firing torpedo tube. They planned for their battleship. By December 1895, they had done it. The reserve tonnage was well under what they needed. Now, normally I would go over the characteristics of the ship. Instead, I just put up a photo of the information for your viewing pleasure. I'll leave it up for 5 seconds, so you can easily pause and get back to the rest of the video. Now, she would serve in various capacities and eventually be decommissioned in January 1914, becoming a hulk, where her various guns and internals were used for the war effort in some capacity. She was old, outdated, and quite frankly, a bad ship. So to sum up some of her problems, she was overweight and had stability issues, had problems firing her main battery, and thankfully no missing parts, unlike Carnot. To dig into it a bit more real quick, the ship was overweight and top-heavy, leading to stability issues, something that all ships in the fleet of samples suffered from. It led to poor seeping and a dangerous tendency to roll. And her gun layout wasn't the best, making for difficult fire control, which added to the stability issues. I think one last thing from Steghini and Constantino sums up the problems with the ships. Although built more rapidly than the pre-dreadnoughts completed in the previous decade, Charles Martel, Carnot, Jagaberry, Misa, and Bouvet spent a long time on the slipways. The first 3 were completed by 1897, and the last 2 followed in June 1898. The French procedure for ordering new construction was so convoluted that men of war, especially battleships, took far longer to complete than almost all major warships built by other European naval powers. Additionally, lack of funds hampered placing orders for more than 1 ship per year, a limitation that resulted in longer construction times, forced rearrangement of the original common design in accordance to initiatives taken by individual shipyards and Russian pre-dreadnought refits dockyards. So originally, this was supposed to be in addition to the bad Soviet-Russian warship design video. I was initially going to put it in that video, but I felt it wasn't appropriate to add it in. I still wanted to discuss Russian pre-dreadnoughts and their proposed conversions, as they aren't necessarily the worst ideas and some were complete. But the idea of refitting all of these pre-dreadnoughts in ways that they wanted to probably wasn't going to be the most cost-effective thing as compared to building new. But I'll leave you to be the judge of that. Following the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian fleet wasn't in a great position, and with the world developing around them, it was not a terrible idea to modernize their existing battleships, but the end product was very interesting to say the least. Anyway, the Russian Naval General Staff's ambitious plan for a fleet of giant dreadnoughts would take a long time to come to fruition. Still, the nation needed its maritime defenses improved, and the defense of the Baltic and Black Sea depended on a fleet of aging pre-dreadnoughts. And with the failure to obtain proper funding for dreadnoughts in 1906, the Naval Ministry was forced to consider a whole host of different ideas for modernizing the pre-dreadnoughts. The modernizations would be radical, and because of that, it would come with a hefty price tag and only a marginal improvement in fighting capabilities. Another consideration was having too many ships tied up with this modernization and not able to be out defending the Russian Empire. The most radical of these reconstruction plans was for a full reconstruction of the Black Sea Fleet battleships, Sinop, George the Victorious, and the 12 Apostles. Yes, I did do some translations for these names. The first two would receive a treatment that was similar to the Shma before the Russo-Japanese War. The hulls would be cut down by a deck level, and new 12-inch 40 caliber guns would be installed, and club armor would replace the less effective compound and steel plate on these ships. The only significant difference being the secondary battery was limited to 8 120mm guns and casemates protected by 3-inch armor rather than the 6-inch 152mm guns featured in pre-war plans. A change that reflected the fact that intermediate batteries were no longer seen as part of battleships' main armament, and the 120mm guns would be more than enough for anti-torpedo boat work. The General Staff wanted to replace the 12 Apostles' old guns with two new 10-inch 254mm turrets and 6-inch 50 caliber guns to replace the old 6-inch. Guns, Culp armor would be used, and the turrets would receive 8 inches of armor. There was opposition to these plans, and in June 1908, the Chief Inspector of Shipbuilding reported the ships would have unsatisfactory stability due to the presence of centerline bulkheads in the machinery spaces, while the average speed of the reconstructed ships would amount to only 13.5 knots. Much slower than the modern ships of the Black Sea Fleet. It was also noted that the ships lacked extensive hull protection required to withstand high explosive shells, something the Russians had experienced in the Russo-Japanese War. The Naval General Staff again raised the idea of reconstruction in 1909 with modern armaments, albeit smaller than battleship guns. This time, 203mm 8-inch guns and single turrets with new 6-inch casemates. The machinery would also be reconstructed. But due to Russia's limited industry, it wasn't feasible to modernize the ships in such radical ways. Less radical proposals in 1907 were also turned down due to less than favorable conditions for such a project. Focus was put on newer ships rather than the older pre-dreadnoughts. That's not to say nothing was done to the pre-dreadnoughts before the First World War, as many had work done to them, some more extensive than others. The three holy hierarchs had work done to her, as her main battery and protection were considered adequate for her to be considered to be a frontline unit. With her eventual modernization, including the removal of her military masts with fighting tops, which were replaced by light pole masts, reduction of the superstructure, removal of old 4.7-inch guns, as well as the light guns minus 2 smaller saluting guns. Increased elevation and modernization of the main battery guns, which improved their rate of fire. It also had a post-dry-instruction top speed of 16 knots, which isn't terrible. According to Stephen McLaughlin in Russian and Soviet battleships, as one of the Black Sea Fleet newest battleships, the Pentelman required much less work. Her 12-inch guns and turrets were upgraded, and her superstructures generally reduced, but little else was done. Some thought was giving improvements to those two ships. Even the suggestion was made to eliminate the 675mm guns between the 8-inch casemates. By this time, such small guns were considered of little value for anti-destroyer work anyway, and installed two 6-inch guns on either side in their place. The General Naval Staff didn't think it was worthwhile to do that. Still, at the end of 1913, they thought it worthwhile to remove the 75mm guns and replace them with an additional 8-inch gun from a training battleship, the Emperor Alexander II. Still, the guns were not delivered before the outbreak of war and postponed indefinitely. More radical proposals for the Black Sea and Baltic battleships were proposed, but like in the past, the cost was too much. And it couldn't be done. To close out this section, I feel it's necessary to quote McLaughlin. Despite the rejection of most of these proposals, important work was done to the pre-dreadnoughts, the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. Fire control equipment was improved, as were guns and mountings. Optical sights and long-based rangefinders were installed, and the slow rate of fire that had plagued Russian ships during the war was solved by the introduction of the well and breech and better loading mechanisms. Gun laying was improved by installing more powerful turret motors in the Janney coupling, which provided for smoother training and elevation motion. Although largely invisible, These improvements substantially increase the combat value of the older ships. He goes on to give some description of the work done to the ships, which mostly consist of modernizing the guns and some of the machinery. I'll list out a few so you get an idea of the more extensive work done for Sinop. In 1910, 4 modern 6-in 45 caliber guns were installed on her upper deck as part of her conversion to an artillery school ship. 1912, 12-in guns removed. 4 8-inch 50 caliber guns mounted on the upper deck. 8 6-in 45 caliber guns were installed on the battery deck. 6 in original hull embracers and 2 aft in former Admiral Salin. 4 47mm and 4 machine guns were installed and torpedo tubes were removed. Central fire control station fitted. Bridge work built up somewhat. There are some more details about other ships, but I'll put them down in the pinned comment. Some rather odd and unique warships here. I don't know what to make of them if I'm being honest. Let me know what you all think down below. Another interesting proposal that Bolzano hybrid refit came about later in the Second World War was the conversion of the Italian heavy cruiser Bolzano into a cruiser carrier cargo ship hybrid, something we have briefly discussed, but we can certainly delve into a bit more. A not so great idea considering the direction the war was headed in. Following her near sinking in August 1942 at the hands of the small submarine HMS Unbroken, Bolzano was beached off the island of Panoria north of Sicily, and after being patched up, she was towed to La Spezia for repairs in October. As early as October, design studies were being drawn up for less aggressive repairs to Bolzano to save on labor and materials through replacing damaged boilers with less machinery. Another design study called for converting Bolzano into a hybrid warship, where the plans called for the removal of Bolzano's superstructure and armament, 4 of the aft funnel to be replaced with a flight deck with a track running down the center of it. Carriages mounting the vessel's aircraft were aligned on the track, which ended at 2 diagonally placed catapults installed in the ship's bow. It was intended to carry 12 aircraft, 10 lined up on the tracks and 2 on either catapult. The plan also called for the removal of some of the ship's machinery to allow for cargo to be carried. Such was the need for escorting aircraft for the Italian convoys to and from North Africa and other possessions in the Mediterranean, along with the need to carry supplies. This idea never really got out of the early stages, and with the Axis surrender in North Africa in May of 1943, it would never go anywhere. She was later sunk in La Spezia harbor by the British using a British Chariot manned torpedo. Now, I think it would be interesting to detail this a bit more. And of course, when it comes to Italian heavy cruisers, we have to turn to Italian heavy cruisers from Trento to Bolzano by Maurizio Braccia and Ostodo de Toro, where they describe her air armament and more details about the conversion. Instead, the designer submitted to Mistat an outlined project for her transformation into an anti-aircraft ship, also suitable for fast transport of 3,500 tons of materials in 5 holds, and capable of embarking and launching by catapult 12 fighters or torpedo aircraft of the Riana AR-2000 type. The work would have taken 5 months, provided that the outfitting was kept simple, and would have concerned the eliminations of boilers 1 and 2, as already decided in the case of restoration to the original design. Splitting the forward funnel, which in any case would have to be rebuilt into 2 smaller side-by-side funnels. Removal of the forward superstructure. Adaptation of the aft superstructure to a merchant-type bridge, removing both the main armament and torpedo launchers, alteration of the ammunition magazines into cargo holds, fitting of a new AA armament, 5 single 90mm 53 caliber guns per side for a total of 10 AA guns. But the final outfit was still to be defined. Installation of a Henkel-type catapult, using one already available in La Spezia, and adopting the launching techniques already employed by Allies on merchant ships converted for the aerial protection of convoys. They go on to detail that the underwater protection would remain as is, and the internal subdivision would be improved. Still, like I mentioned before, nothing came of it due to the war situation. Such a conversion was not a great idea, as the regime Marino was in no position to challenge the Allies in early 1943 due to oil shortages and other shortcomings of their fleet. The addition of such a hybrid warship wasn't going to change the outcome of the war. Investing in something like the converted liner Aquila earlier in the decade, or in the 1930s would have made more of a difference. Or better yet, the incomplete battleship Francesco Caracciolo would have been interesting. Let me know what you all think down below when it comes to bad battleships conclusion. And conversions, there are plenty out there for me to dig into. And let me know what future ships you'd like to see in this series. Anyway, remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.